Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are finalizing and wrapping up our discussion on the artillery platoon options available to you in bolt action. This is designed to kind of do a catch-all. It also catches and discusses a bunch of things like versatile guns, for example, which like we could technically do our own video on it. At one point I did, but because of the fact that they are quite different and they range from, light AT guns to super heavy AT guns, and they range as regards what they do for indirect fire and whether or not they can use spotters or not. Like there was just a lot of different things. And so I decided, you know what, let's wrap some of that conversation into this one because everything else about it is more or less true, right? And I don't know necessarily that it needs to have its own video. So instead, we're just going to talk about it as part of the overall discussion of, is it worthwhile to run an artillery platoon in bolt action? And so as we look at this, we're going to be looking at this in a couple of different ways. Obviously, it's going to differ from how we actually gauged the effectiveness of any particular piece of an artillery platoon. We're going to look, first of all, at scenario considerations, how certain scenarios are not going to play well or are going to play well into the realm of artillery. We're going to look at board considerations, deployment considerations, matchup considerations, choice considerations. So what kind of artillery choice are you making? Nation considerations, both which nations are more likely and more prevalent to use these versus others that may not feel like they're absolutely necessary, as well as what kinds of choices of opponents by nation you might be more advantaged by if you end up facing them and you're bringing in artillery platoon. We're then going to talk about some potential changes that I would recommend, and we're going to kind of end with the so what question, right? Why does all of this matter? So to start out, in terms of scenarios, first of all, if this is a scenario that counts kill points, artillery are a pretty good choice, all things considered. You are primarily paying for offense, and offense tends to matter more than defense when it comes to actually removing dice. There are quite a few ways that people can bypass things like cover saves. There are quite a few ways that they can bypass an inherently good difficulty to wound, most notably by the fact that this is a dice-based game. And sometimes your opponent's going to be rolling 4 dice to wound on 5s, and they're going to get all 4 of them, right? And these things do happen. So the benefit of the artillery platoon is that you are paying for pretty good long-reach offense. That's what you're doing. And in addition, your crew is going to be between 3 and 7 men. And 3 to 7 men is actually pretty durable, especially if they've got something like, innate cover, like a gun shield, whether they're deployed in covers, we'll talk about later. There are a lot of ways to really expand and extend the livelihood and the likeliness of finishing out the game with an artillery piece, while also giving yourself a pretty good chance of removing some enemy models, if not entire units, when you end up firing. If you're doing objective controlling missions, artillery are also a good choice. As we've noted in a lot of these videos, they are a great unit that you can leave camped on an objective to defend it. They're also pretty good, typically, at being able to reach far enough across the field that they can at least pin down, if not actually remove, enemies that are protecting another objective to support your troops as they're moving up, and that's excellent. If you're doing a maneuver or positioning fight where, like, you need to cross over into the enemy's deployment zone or where you need to get off the board, kind of iffy. On the one hand, toes are cheap, so you can technically move these up and maneuver them around, which is great. If you're playing something kind of like, the sectors scenario, this is the kind of you could deploy near the edge of your deployment zone, and on a turn where you don't have really, really good shots, just move them right into the next zone. If they're one of those lighter guns, smaller guns that are able to move on their own without the aid of a tow, at which point then it gets pretty easy to use. And so that's pretty nice. But obviously, this is not the kind of unit you want to be trying to run off the board, right? Like you paid for firepower. It's supposed to be shooting at things. And the one thing that all artillery choices have in common is they can't move and shoot in the same turn. It also you will tend to find that for whatever scenario you're playing, regular and veteran crews tend to perform better as a general rule. While yes, if you're firing indirect with an artillery piece, for example, you don't technically suffer that -1 to hit penalty. However, regular and veteran crews are harder to remove, which helps you in kill point scenarios. They do tend to find it easier to remove enemies, which is nice. So they are less likely to cough up points in a scenario, and they're more likely to activate, which in something like objective controlling and maneuvering is something that you kind of need, right? I mean, you need to be able to actually maneuver when you need to maneuver, and if that's the case, passing order tests is a really, really good idea. So in general, my recommendation, while there's technically grounds for why you might take an artillery crew of some kind inexperienced, multiple rocket launchers, for example, in general, regular and veteran crews tend to perform better. Looking at board considerations, there's a couple of things to think about. First of all, you really want a board with about medium density in cover. Okay. On the one hand, a low density table means the world is your oyster. You can shoot at pretty much whatever you want. On the other hand, it means pretty much anything in the universe can shoot at you. And that is potentially problematic because, again, most of these have 3 men, maybe 4, right? In some cases, in the case of the Howling Cow multiple rocket launcher, 2. So toward that end, shooting at you even just a couple times is going to be problematic. On the other hand, flipping to the other extreme, a heavy density board is also potentially problematic because it means you probably aren't going to be shooting until you're like 12, 16, 18 inches away from each other. And if that's the case, there's a very good chance that if they invested in things like, say, submachine guns or flamethrowers, you're not really going to get more than one shot to try to remove something. And a lot of the artillery pieces that you purchase are not really designed to be one shot, one kill items. That's not really what their intention is, especially in case they're only hitting on, say, 4s, like anything that isn't an AT gun is going to have. You really want to give yourself multiple chances to be able to do something to the enemy. And so a heavy density board, also not very useful. You want a medium density board. That's the ideal location for when you're playing with an artillery platoon, because you will get sufficient protection for yourself as well as for the guys that you're trying to cover as they're advancing up the board, while at the same time also giving you enough of a firing lane, call it up to 24 inches or so, that you can shoot down, realistically having a chance to take 1 or more shots at an enemy before you are seriously in trouble. In general, you would really prefer to have hard cover in your deployment zone, so that way you can deploy your artillery piece, remembering that you also want them to have a good solid firing lane. So while you can park a light artillery or a medium artillery or something like that behind a building and then use a spotter to shoot around it and hit over stuff, while that is very safe for your gun, it can also be very easy to blind your gun and make them less effective. We don't want that. We want a clear lane where we can fire direct, or if our spotter goes down, to be able to still contribute firing regardless of what we're doing, while at the same time having good solid cover for yourself. This means that generally walls and defensive positions like bunkers and trenches are generally going to be better for you than ruins and forests. Ruins and forests, of course, not being quite as useful because unless you have field craft, which things like Geber's Jaeger style lower end light artillery can take, by the way, in the Germany book, short of that, unless you have fieldcraft, you can't move and reposition after you're already deployed. Now, sometimes something like a ruin's just going to have to work in a pinch, right? You got to keep them safe. So maybe deploy them in a heavy cover ruined position where it's rough terrain, so they can't move after that, but they would be able to at least get a good cover save. That's all fine and good. The problem with deploying in situations like that is you are asking to have mortar rounds dropped on you because you can't get away, right? So in general, you want walls and defensive positions. Those are the ideal. If you could put this thing in a bunker, that's like the best thing ever. If you could put it behind a stone wall, that's also like the best thing ever. And then finally, your spotter location access is something you do need to think about with the board. Where am I deploying this so that it has its firing lanes? And then if I intend to try to use a spotter, where would I then put the spotter to be able to see even more options and have more opportunities than I had before? For deployment considerations, you are going to need cover. While you can technically deploy these anywhere you want, and if they have a gun shield, then at least you're getting a 5+ save. 3 to 5 men doesn't last very long unless you're getting a cover save, especially if you're only getting a 5+ or 6+ cover save or something like that, right? You want to have a 4+ or better cover save. That is the ideal scenario, okay? You also want to deploy with 1 or 2 firing lane access. That way, if your enemy doesn't move along one route, you can shoot down another route. Also very useful. You want to have potential overwatch over objectives, so either guarding objectives yourself and being able to then shoot toward other objectives, or if the objectives are all near the center of the map, for example, making sure that wherever you place it, it is defensible, but you can also overlook whatever would be guarding that objective to kind of keep the enemy from just camping there, okay? You'll then also want, again, walls over ruins and buildings, although, I mean, I guess if you If you know that you can only tow the gun to move it anyway, so if you're going for like a heavier artillery or heavier AT gun, for example, you might just deploy it in a ruin anyway, because the rules about towing, and we're going to talk about tows and the fixes that I would recommend for tows in a future video coming up very soon. But just suffice it to say for now, if you're using tows in order to maneuver things around, at that point, you might as well just say you're not going to move it. You're going to waste so much of the game that you have paid firepower for just trying to maneuver around. You might as well just say, you know what, I'm going to take my chance with the mortars. I'm going to have somebody else go after the mortar instead, so that way we can stay around on the table. So at that point, if you're running a really, really big gun, if you got a heavy autocannon Bofors, for example, you might as well just put it in a ruin. It'll be fine. In terms of matchup considerations, we're going to be looking at the following 9 styles of armies that, and these have been talked about by Bo Mortensen and many other people over time. These are not necessarily unique. You know, some of them will have overlap. People can mix and match amongst a bunch of these, but these are different kinds. And we're going to take a look at how this platoon performs over and against all of these. Okay, so first of all, is against armor armies. These are people who have invested heavily in one or more armor platoons. It's an iffy choice. On the one hand, you are getting very, very cheap firepower. For the amount of shots that you are getting and the power that you're getting, they are paying way more points for their armored vehicles. On the other hand, they can move and shoot and you cannot, which means you have to already have your firing lane set up. And when they activate a unit, they know whether or not they are in your firing lane or not, right? And they know whether or not they're going into your firing lane or not. And so in many respects, you are going to lack agency to really make a difference on the board, okay? So realize that your artillery assets, being more static, are easier to plan around. And that means you might win an effective use of ambush orders or scenario objectives where they have to move in a specific direction or they have to go to a specific place. Short of that, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble. But if that is the case, you could do quite well. Assault armies are also an iffy choice, mostly because it's a question of, can you injure them, remove them, or pin them down before they can overrun you, right? And if you're facing something like, say, a cavalry section or something like that that has a wrecking maneuver on top of all of that, or an assault unit, maybe a bunch of guys with submachine guns in a transport that also has recce, it does get more tricky to do so. So I'm going to call this an iffy choice. It can work, has worked, have seen it work, but that doesn't mean it always will, okay? Flamethrower or barbecue armies. Honestly, artillery are a really good choice because even if they have a transport, they have to get really, really, really close in order to hit you. And if they want to get to that sweet, sweet, point blank range in order to get the shot off, they're still probably moving in order to get to that spot. So you're still only looking at like a 3+ to hit, right, on a given turn, which, I mean, I've used AT guns. I know that they don't always hit, so flamethrowers don't always hit, right? So that's the nice thing about it. And of course, with the ambush order, the benefit of artillery is that because you all have dramatically more than 6 inches of range, more than 12 inches of range in the case of a vehicle one, you know that they do actually have to come to you if they want to try to dislodge you and get you out, right? So that is one of the advantages of working around those. I think in general, your artillery crews are going to have a pretty good chance of putting some pins on a unit before they jump out and start using their flamethrower. If there's a pin still left on a unit that is then using a flamethrower, you're looking at 4s or worse to hit. And that is fantastic. Greatest hits or mixed bag armies. These are people who want a lot of different tools or toolkit style approach to wargaming. In these cases, it's honestly a pretty good choice. And that's mostly because they haven't tried to overpower a specific aspect of the game. They have probably some armor, but not a dramatic amount of armor, which means your artillery can probably handle or at least help to pin down and frustrate whatever they do have. And from a counter deployment perspective, it is easier to take advantage of that deployment. Similarly, they may have some flamethrowers thrown in, but they probably don't have very many. So you can handle those a little bit better. If they've got mortars, they probably don't have tons of mortars, so you can handle those. You can remove spotters. If they have, forward observers thrown into the list, you can handle those tools to keep yourself safe from the incoming strike relatively effectively because they don't have 4 guys all trying to drop incoming planes or artillery barrages on you, right? So toward that end, the nice thing about greatest hits mixed bag is that because they are diversified and they have quite a few things going on, you might be able to have enough tools to deal with all of the tools that they have through your artillery platoon. Gunline armies are a great choice, arguably the best choice for fighting against with artillery because they want to stay at range. You want to stay at range. You guys kind of want to keep to a more static level of play. And since you want to both have a more static level of play, if you have invested in artillery and they've been investing points in armor, they overpaid for that armor, right? So in general, you're probably going to have more firepower coming toward them than they are toward you. And that is good. Horde armies. Honestly, pretty iffy. It really comes down to how much can you shred them before they get in too close? How much can you remove from them before all of those light mortars or all of those light machine guns or whatever it is that they were able to purchase in all of those squads start doing their work, right? And that's the real question. So honestly, coin toss. I'm not entirely sure how that one works out. It really depends on the army and what they're working with. For mechanized armies, these are armies that involve some armored units, but also most importantly, transports and typically armored transports moving men up to be more effective. Once again, pretty iffy because of the fact that the enemy is speedy and they're relatively resilient. So just pinning them doesn't always work. A lot of mechanized armies are going to run a company commander, so that way they can get force concentration into wherever it is that they need to go. And if that's the case, I don't know. How many pins did you put down there? They may still be rolling for an 11 or lower. Difficult to say. That being said, if you can remove the transports, or at least immobilize the transports, so that now they got a foot slog in order to get stuff done, they overpaid dramatically for what they wanted to be able to do, and that's a really good sign for you. Mortar-heavy armies, artillery is a bad choice. If they've got tons and tons of mortars on the other side, if you're looking even at 10 light mortars that are coming at you because somebody decided that they wanted to take, a couple of heavy weapons platoons with a couple of rifle platoons, and they've got like close to a dozen light mortars coming at you. It's going to be really hard to remove all of them, especially if they just decide, I don't need that one to do anything for me right now. I'm just going to go down and avoid this attack, not suffer nearly as many wounds. If that ends up happening, like it doesn't take too many mortar rounds falling on you generally to cause problems for artillery platoons. So just be really careful if you're fighting a mortar-heavy army. You need to find a way to shut down those mortars and make sure they either can't see you because of how they deployed, or they can't hit you because they went down. And then skirmish-heavy armies are also a pretty iffy choice. And that comes down mostly, again, to the fact that they want to be moving and scooting and moving and scooting and kind of working around you, hemming you in, maneuvering around you while still firing. And so you, being a more static piece, you do lack agency with these. Okay? Now, obviously, you're not just going to be running an army that's purely artillery, right? So you're going to have other assets that are working along these. But if you're bringing an artillery platoon, this gives you an idea of what kind of armies, when you see them across the table, you feel really good about what your artillery platoon can bring, which ones are going to be a little more situational, and you're going to have to play into it to set the stage, as we'll talk about a little bit later, to make sure that they're more effective, and which armies you look at and you're going to say, wow, my artillery are not going to be doing much work for me this game. So in terms of choice considerations, your first, of course, are artillery. We tend to fall into 4 categories, and the first one is artillery. Short of any changes that we will recommend later, okay, if we just assume you're working with the stuff in the book as written, nobody's monkeying around with points changes or monkeying around with special rules or anything else like that, light howitzers, and specifically versatile light howitzers, which you can get with both Great Britain as well as Bulgaria, are the best choices because you get a flexible light howitzer for anti-infantry removal, or you get an anti-tank gun, which is really decent for at least pinning most armor, if not actually doing serious removal against much lighter armor. You'll also find recoilless guns. Recoilless guns tend to be cheaper, first of all, because they basically never come with a gun shield, which is kind of nice. Save yourself 5 points, and you'd probably want to deploy it in better cover than a 5+ anyway, so it's not bad for you to lose the gun shield. And especially, again, going back to when you have something like a Gebersjäger unit, if you have the ability to take Fieldcraft on that artillery piece, that is even better. Because then you've got yourself a gun that can shoot quite effectively and can maneuver through rough terrain. So you can move it into a ruin, you can move it into a forest, all of which is fantastic. And if the mortars start coming, you can move away from those areas, which is really good. You can technically go with medium to heavy howitzers. You'd really be doing that because you want to be able to reliably drop 2 or more pins on a unit. It is hard to justify the cost. That is the biggest issue. And for those of you who have watched the videos, you already know why. Let's point you back to those so you can refresh yourself on those rules. For anti-tank guns, honestly, you want to kind of limit yourself to light to medium AT guns. Bigger guns than that, while they are very good at removing pieces, because they're static, your enemy's going to know where those are, and they're going to plan their armor maneuvering away from those spots. So I don't think you're going to get much out of the medium to, well, the heavy to super heavy anti-tank guns. Light to medium, I think is fine. I think it's a nice sweet spot where most armor is going to be pinned by you, especially if you're playing on a board where you're not going to have more than a 24-inch corridor anyway. You have a really good chance of at least getting pins on the enemy, if not actually doing damage to the enemy. And then similarly, your medium AT guns are just good for just all around goodness at being able to lock down stuff that you're up against or remove really, really cheap stuff that they tried to spam. Again, if you can get a versatile anti-tank gun, like say the ZIS-3, for example, for the Soviets, this is a fantastic choice. Because again, you get that flexibility between, well, here's my really nice anti-infantry shot with the howitzer side of things, or here's my really nice anti-tank gun shot against armor. Your anti-aircraft guns, honestly, light or heavy anti-aircraft guns are both really great. I think in general, going for the dual anti-aircraft guns instead of, say, the quad anti-aircraft guns, like that flak Vierling that you see over there on the right-hand side, tends to be better because from a cost perspective, you will find it easier to make your points back. And they are still very, very, very effective against infantry and reliably doing pins to armored vehicles. And so because of that, I think 2 is fine. Don't really need more than that. If you want to go to 3, which I think there's a British Polston gun that can get 3. And then, of course, you got the flak Vierling style stuff that can take 4. If you want to do that, you can. If you can get a heavy machine gun anti-aircraft gun, those do exist. Those are also really great because HMGs are still getting, typically, although with the Americans, we got a nice little nerf that made it not so much over there. But in general, a heavy machine gun as an anti-aircraft gun is still getting all 6 shots, which is really nice. And so you can really make that work for you against infantry. And if your enemy isn't that far away on a medium density board, you might still be within 18 inches. You might be a solid pin generator against armored vehicles as well. So on the whole, not too shabby. And then multiple rocket launchers, honestly, this is a strategic decision because with a 36-inch minimum range now, first 2 turns, you're going to get some shots. After the first 2 turns, it's going to be really hard. So it really comes down to, did you make your value back, at least in terms of board control and psychological warfare, if not actual points removed, in the first 2 turns? And if the answer is no, then the answer is no, and that's it, right? And, it's sad, it's unfortunate, but that's kind of how it is. So I think it comes down to your overall strategy. What else do you have in your army? Do you need multiple rocket launchers in the back providing the support? Or is it just something that's, designed to try to mess up the enemy, but maybe you could do a little more effectively in other ways? From a nation's consideration, we're going to start by looking at which nations are going to look at their list and say, well, what other options do I have? Of course, I'm taking an artillery platoon because what else would I do? Because there are just some armies where if you want to field reliable heavy weapons or heavy weapons at all, this is how you have to do this. Belgium has armored vehicles. Some of those are actually pretty good, but they're really light. A lot of them are open topped. You're barely getting, I think they're all damage value 7+, if I'm not mistaken. So they're very easy to remove. There's just a lot of danger that's going on here. And so because of that, in general, Belgium's going to look and say, well, if I can get the same firepower or better firepower, heavy auto cannons, medium AT guns, the only access you get to medium AT guns, better artillery than a light howitzer. If you're only getting that from an artillery platoon, you're probably going to take it. Similarly, Bulgaria can technically take old Renault French tanks. They're not particularly good. They're going to be very easily removed by enemy armor, especially serious enemy armor. Go up against one Stug with Bulgarian standard armor, and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And in before somebody says, Axis support. True, that is one vehicle, and one vehicle is easy to plan around. So I think a lot of Bulgarian generals are going to look and they're going to say, I think artillery would be a good thing to lean into because I'm going to need firepower, I'm going to need removal power, and I'm not going to get that in too many ways elsewhere. So I'm going to go with artillery. Denmark, once again, we're in the place of not a lot of great armored vehicles. Greece, not a lot of great armored vehicles. The Netherlands, great armored vehicles if you like heavy machine guns. You do have some light AT guns. You have a lot of machine guns, just, standard 30 caliber machine guns. But in terms of heavy weapons, you're probably going to be leaning on that artillery platoon. Norway, of course, doesn't get any vehicles, period, except for the common transports. So they're going to be relying on artillery, especially since they don't get an anti-tank infantry option either, not even AT rifles. So your only heavy weapons are mortars and light artillery. So you better believe, Norway people, I'm just going to predict it now, are going to be running at least 2 artillery platoons, just because you're going to want the firepower. Partisans, partisans are tricky because there are some really, really great soft skin vehicles that can do some firepower. So there's that. On the other hand, partisans, not known for great vehicles, and they're not really well known for general anti-tank and heavy weapons. Like you can take bazookas as one example. Bazookas take a lot of skill to keep alive in third edition because you're not getting that inherent -1 to hit for being a small team. Going down does not make it particularly difficult to hurt you now, right? In fact, in some cases, it doesn't do anything for you at all. So in general, partisans, I think you're going to find them leaning into things like artillery a lot more than elsewise because it's a great way to get some more serious firepower. It's the only way to get an autocannon, period, that's reliable and not going to die to a single shot from a rifle. So in general, I think that's an advantageous choice for them. And then Romania. Romania used to be one of the artillery heavyweights, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing you'd expect them showing up with like 3 in a single platoon. Nowadays, they still have it, which is great. They can still use artillery, which is good. It's just that, like, again, you're working with relatively light armor. They lost some of their armor choices from second edition, which I anticipate are going to come back in the Armies of book. But yeah, all of these, I think, are armies that are looking at artillery platoons and saying, well, that's how I'm going to get my firepower, so that's what I'm going to take. It can also be a really good choice to take artillery batteries to counter infantry horde armies. So armies like Bulgaria, Denmark, Greece, Norway, and partisans are going to be relying a lot on infantry because they just don't have a lot elsewise. They have a lot of points that they need to spend, and they don't have really expensive armor. They don't have really good armor, and so infantry are going to look an awful lot more appealing. And artillery platoons tend to work pretty well against infantry because most infantry don't move that fast. And in as much as those infantry do move pretty fast, they don't want to be running through ruins and forests. They want to maneuver around a bunch of these things, which means you can probably see them and shoot at them before they come at you. So that's really nice. It's also a good counter to light armor armies. This is very cheap firepower that will pin enemies, because if they're running damage value 8 or lower, 6, 7, 8 sort of vehicles, you're going to pin them with literally anything you run in an artillery platoon, as long as they aren't like, 46 inches away with a light autocannon, right? And you're pretty likely actually to penetrate with everything you run in a standard artillery platoon. And so nations like Belgium, Bulgaria, Finland, Greece, Hungary, Japan, the partisans, Poland, and Romania are very much living off of damage value 7, damage value 8 vehicles. And that means an artillery platoon is good enough. It will handle these for an awful lot cheaper. They're probably buying these cheaper armor because they're like, well, if somebody buys a medium tank or a heavy tank, I'm getting 2 or 3 of my own guys for the same cost. And you're looking at them saying, well, I'm getting 3 of my artillery choices for every 2 that you're spending over there. Possibly 3 for every 1 if we're talking about light autocannon anti-aircraft guns. They're also really good counters against air observer armies. These are obviously very niche. It's mostly just the United States that ends up stacking multiple air observers. But if you can have multiple anti-aircraft guns just sitting there, hanging out, shredding against infantry, but also just ready for an air observer should they show up, because then in between turns, without having to activate for the next turn or lose your turn, you can just whip out 2 to 4 shots for each of these and only looking for 3 to drive them off. That's not bad at all. You can really make that work. And since you're on a rotating platform, you don't have to worry about arcs at all in terms of where the airstrike comes in. And then finally, it is a good counter against multiple rocket launchers, which sounds kind of weird because multiple rocket launchers you'd think would want stationary static targets like artillery. The thing is, since they're only ever hitting on a 6 and they don't ever get a chance to stack multiple shots against the same unit, they can't really do retribution particularly well against you, but you can do pretty effective retribution against them. And so armies like Germany, Hungary, the Soviet Union, and the United States were probably the most likely offenders to try to really take advantage of multiple rocket launchers. You actually have a pretty solid counter against them by using an artillery platoon, and for pretty cheap as well. So what changes would I recommend? I would recommend one of 2 things. Either, number 1, a points rebalance for larger field guns. This is primarily designed for medium and heavy howitzers, but I think I would also include things like heavy and super heavy anti-tank guns. Anti-aircraft guns are fine. Multiple rocket launchers are fine. If anything, to be fair, they might actually need a points increase. But in general, I think those are okay for where they're at. And the primary reason for this is that maneuver warfare is just so powerful right now that it makes it difficult to even consider taking an artillery platoon at a point because you're just not getting the ability to take shots when you want them against a lot of enemies. It's just so difficult to do. So my recommendation is make them a little bit cheaper because they aren't all that effective, and then at least the value add looks a little bit better. The alternative option, and I actually kind of like this more because it means we don't have to errata every single book that's come out and every single book that's currently being produced, which is really nice, is I would just change one little rule in the howitzer special rule, which is that any gun of 100 millimeters or higher, so this would be medium and heavy artillery, will either ignore cover saves when firing direct, similar to what they do with indirect fire, or reduce a cover save to the best you can get from cover from buildings and stuff like that is a 6+. Goes down to a 4+ if the unit is down. Okay. And sure, if the unit's infiltrator, why not? Go ahead and add the infiltrator bonus onto it and bring it down to 5s and 3s at best, instead of 4s starting out, 3s and then potentially even better going down to 2s wherever you are. And there's a couple of reasons why I would recommend this. The first is it's very historically accurate. I mean, a lot of buildings are not going to actually protect you short of a bunker. Short of a bunker, most fortification style stuff is not actually going to protect you from a 105 or 155 millimeter howitzer. Okay. Whatever forest you're in is not going to give you a 5+ save against that stuff. There's going to be shrapnel everywhere. Unless you've hit the ground, there's a very good chance you're going to be hurting pretty hard if you're anywhere near the vicinity of this gun. And so I think that will be helpful. It also means that if you're only going to land 2 to 3 shots every game anyway, you're going to remove more than 2 or 3 models over the course of a game, in which case it's going to be more likely to actually make its points back. And it suddenly feels like this 15 centimeter howitzer over here for the Germans, the SIG 33, would actually be a useful gun to field. Okay. And what this also means realistically is that regardless of how you do this, really the most effective way you have to kind of make artillery platoons work is you have to really use a combined arms approach. Okay, you have to flush out the enemy using, armored vehicles or engineers or submachine guns, get them to move and maneuver and position in such a way that they need to move into the firing lane. And then your artillery is set up, they're already in position, and they fire away at the enemy. That is extremely hard to do unless you have a very specific set of scenarios that require people to move from one place to another and through open spaces. And so if we want to make artillery platoons a worthwhile choice so that it isn't just a tank game, I think we're going to need one of these two changes so that they become much more effective in use as a combined arms strategy. But then finally, why does this matter? Right? Why is it important that the game make it so that artillery platoons make sense to take and that they're a reasonable, viable choice? Well, for starters, as a minor nations player, while I technically own armies that are from the major nations as well, I do primarily play minor nations. They have extremely limited firepower. A lot of these cap out at light AT guns on their armored vehicles. Some of them don't even get that. And so they're really relying on those artillery pieces to provide them with the ability to even pin veteran medium armor, let alone do better than that, right? And so if you make artillery a tier 2 choice, you're going to make minor nations tier 2 choices, okay? And I don't think that's particularly healthy for the game. It's not healthy for warlord sales. It's not healthy for third-party sales. It's not healthy for anybody. Tournaments eventually just become 4 or 5 armies. You always play against the same kinds of armies every single time. Wouldn't it be nice if all 21 or so armies that are present in the game could be really competitive? And they could be competitive because it doesn't matter whether or not you have a really solid armor selection or not, because you have options for reasonable artillery as well. That I think will help. As we mentioned, current armor meta also creates kind of first-class and second-class citizens among nations. And it's hard to argue with. I mean, I've gone to now 1 3rd edition tournament, played quite a few games of 3rd edition, and I can tell you it's an armor game right now, right? Armies are coming up near the top. They invested in really good quality armor, not necessarily big armor, not necessarily lots of armor, but they invested in quality armor. And people who went with other stuff found that they were having a really hard time just trying to stay competitive on objectives, right? And so, honestly, I think one of the easiest ways to tone down armor is not by monkeying with all the points levels for every armored vehicle ever or anything like that. I think it's just giving a slight boost to the artillery platoon and making it a little more effective. In addition, cover rules make it hard to remove infantry behind armor. So if your enemy is moving up a 6-man squad or a 7-man squad behind an armored vehicle, like the Americans did with the M4 Sherman, for example, in real life, if that's how they're maneuvering up their men, if you can't remove armor, so that way at least you stop the cover and force the infantry to come out from behind it at some point, it is really, really hard to even remove infantry. So, if you can't remove armor and you can't remove infantry because artillery is not effective enough, you have a problem for some nations. It presents a real viable issue toward even being able to win a match. And so we need ways to make artillery capable. And part of making it capable, I think, is just a few tiny, tiny tweaks to the rules to make them better. A lot of minor nations don't have other reliable counters other than armor. And a lot of their armor is very subpar. A lot of it is 1920s, 1930s tech. In some cases, 1917 and 1918 tech. And that's not good when you could potentially be fighting a late war Soviet tank. It's not going to be effective. And then finally, a more pragmatic reasons to why it matters for making artillery more effective is frankly the bottom line. It sells STLs for people who are third-party creators selling virtual files, for people to 3D print. It sells physical models for everybody who makes their own models or for people who are buying Warlord models. So just reasonably and practically, a rising tide lifts all boats. So personally, I would argue we should lift artillery. That's the tide that we should rise. Okay, because it will mean that a lot of wonderful, passionate people, whether they work for Warlord or whether they work for Rubicon or whether they work for Empress or Artisan or Brushworks or anybody else, anybody else who's making guns, it helps all of them. All of them get extra business. All of them get extra love, which encourages them to make more stuff, to give us more toys to play with. And in my opinion, that is a good thing. Okay, so that's my argument. Are artillery platoons good? Yes. I think they fill a lot of roles. I think they can be quite durable. I think that they can, against certain armies, perform really, really well. And I think they would actually be a viable, reasonable choice for a lot more people if there were some slight tweaks made. Not dramatic, just slight. If you are in agreement, please do let me know down below. It's always nice to hear what people are thinking. If you are not in agreement, please by all means let me know down below because I'm very curious to see what you have to say. I have no desire to turn the game into a gun line game. I think Terrain is doing a fine job of keeping everybody from just sitting back and shooting at each other. And I think that's a healthy thing. And so with the knowledge that Terrain is making it so you can't just reach out across the table with 60 inches worth of range. You're probably going to be reaching out with less than 30 inches worth of range. I think it is helpful for us just to consider ways that we can make it so that artillery can still be a reasonable choice in the game while not also going so crazy as to make it purely an artillery game. And I think there are some reasonable ways to do that. If you like our content, please let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.